Good morning. It is Wednesday, February the 2nd, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare and the Pledge of Allegiance and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have no free lunch, how we got here, dumbing down, we need fools. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work. Thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Thank you. And now the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 2nd. I will purify your life with my fire. On the day that I will come like a furnace that purifies silver, and I will purify you like I purify gold and silver. I will redeem you from every lawless deed and purify you for myself to be my own special people, zealous for good works. Draw near to me, and I will draw near to you. Humble yourself in my sight, and when my purifying work is complete, I will lift you up and purge you with my holy fire, so that you become an offering before me of righteousness. I have tested you and refined you as silver is refined. I have allowed you to pass through the fire and through water, but I brought you out to rich fulfillment. I have preserved your soul among the living and will not allow your feet to be moved. Malachi chapter 3, verses 2 through 3, Zechariah 13, verse 9, Psalm 66, verses 8 through 12. Prayer declaration. Lord, purify my life with your fire. Refine me like silver. Purge my life from sin and imperfection as you purge gold and silver, that I may become an offering before you of righteousness. I will live my life by denying ungodliness and world lusts, and I will live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present age. And that was the Daily Declaration for Spiritual Warfare for February the 2nd. Thank you, thank you. Who is the true conservative? He is the person that understands that conservatism is not just about politics, but culture as well. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He is open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he is better than the socialist. He is a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. Thank you, thank you. And now there's no free lunch. The more information that's out there, the greater the returns to just being willing to sit down and apply yourself. Information isn't what's scarce, it's the willingness to do something with it. Tyler Cohen. This is the heart of economics as human action. No information or gathering of information is worth a hill of beans apart from the human action brought to the information. Tenacity, creativity, and initiative create wealth. Information is as abundant as sand. And that was the from the book, There's No Free Lunch. Thank you, thank you. And now, dumbing down. The catalog of the University of Texas at Arlington touted an exciting new offering for the fall semester of 1973, a credit course in belly dancing. It cannot be said with absolute certainty that this was the first college credit course in belly dancing. The United States is a big country, and perhaps somebody beat UT to it. But the University of Texas was certainly leading the plunge toward a new definition of university-level work. The 2 decades after the end of the war were a time of rising standards in American education. Average scores on the Scholastic Aptitude Test hit their all-time high in the spring of 1963. Virtually all American teenagers attended high school. The once tiny universities expanded at an even more blinding clip. We may snicker now at the era's often awkward pretension to culture, quiz shows, the Boston Pops, Time magazine cover stories about Arnold Toynbee, the oh-so-serious painters in turtlenecks smoking and arguing in the Red Lion bar. But risible as the pretensions of the 1950s could be, they reflected a genuine and admirable aspiration to democratize high culture without debasing it. Mid-century America was materially egalitarian, but intellectually hierarchical, an outlook precisely the opposite of our own. Modern America is prepared to tolerate vast inequalities of wealth. What it will not tolerate is any claim of intellectual or cultural inequality. The 1950s were offended by the John D. Rockefeller pious self-justification, quote, "The good Lord gave me my money," unquote. Modern Americans are offended by Saul Bellow's mocking query, quote, "Where's the Tolstoy of the Zulus?" unquote. As the Bellow example suggests, our impatience with claims of cultural excellence is very closely linked to racial politics. After 350 years of slavery and segregation, it was hardly surprising that standardized tests should find a big gap between the skills of black and white Americans. Only 15% of black IQ test takers score as well as the median white test taker. A 1977 study by the Educational Testing Service found that 75% of the blacks admitted to law school over the previous few years would have been turned down had their applications been weighed on the academic merits alone. One response to these dismal facts might have been patience. Desegregation was barely a decade old in the mid-1970s. Black educational attainments had been rising handsomely for half a century. The average black IQ score in the 1980s was higher than the average white score in the 20s. In the time, the gap was bound to close. Patience, however, had fallen out of style. Black Americans had waited patiently since 1863, more than long enough. So the institutions that had once counted on standardized tests to pick candidates objectively for civil service jobs, university admission, and professional school now began to cast about for subterfuges to evade those tests. In 1976, Jane Mercer, the chairman of the Department of Sociology at the University of California in Riverside, devised race norming, a technique that graded test takers according to their performance relative only to test takers of the same race. If the fifth best white test taker received a score of 95 for answering 95 out of 100 questions correctly, then the fifth best black test taker would also receive a 95, even if she answered only 80 out of 100 questions correctly. Race norming found its widest use in civil service examinations. Universities and law schools preferred to use the less scientific method of the quota and the straightforward double standard. The technique could be used to even things up between the sexes, too. In April 1979, the Army announced that while male recruits would be expected to score 50 out of 100 on its selection test, women would be required to score only 31. It can be humiliating to be on the receiving end of a double standard, and no matter how often those enforcing the double standard assure you that it is perfectly fair, in the end a handout will sting. Those of us who have graduated professional school over the past 15 to 20 years and are not white, writes Yale law professor Stephen Carter, travel career paths that are frequently bumpy with suspicions that we did not earn the right to be where we are. We bristle when others raise what might be called the qualification question. Did you get into school or get hired because of a special program? And that prickly sensitivity is the best evidence, if any is needed, of the principal costs of racial preferences. Some called on educators to soothe that prickly sensitivity by abolishing the standards that had made the double standards necessary in the first place. At a July 1971 meeting of the largest black legal organization, the National Bar Association, the group's president, Edward Bell, a Detroit attorney, demanded the abolition of bar examinations. In 1976, John Ryer, president of the country's largest teachers union, the National Education Association, called for radical reform of the scholastic aptitude test to ensure the equality of black and white scores. A federal judge ruled in 1979 that the state of Florida had violated the U.S. Constitution when it required high school graduates to pass a literacy test before receiving their diplomas. One could pile on 100 more examples. Bar exams, the SAT, and literacy tests all survived this ordeal of criticism, but they did not survive unscathed. The idea that seemingly objective academic and intellectual standards were somehow arbitrary, unjust, even racist, had been injected into the American bloodstream, and there it lingers to our day. Back in a minute. Thank you. The critique of objective academic standards was especially welcome in the 1970s because the attendance of all American students, white and black, had begun to slip. In the spring of 1963, the average score on the verbal portion of the SAT was 478 out of 800. The average score on the math portion was 502. Over the next decade, the verbal score declined by about 7%, and the math score by about 4%. American educators explained away the decline by pointing to the big increase in the number of students taking the SAT between 1963 and 1970, and to the changing demographics of those students. More minorities, more students from low-income backgrounds, and so on. But after 1970, the demographics of the test takers stabilized, and the decline continued regardless. Verbal scores declined by almost another 10% between 1970 and 1980, and math scores by another further 6%. Scores dropped noticeably on college achievement tests and on the test of standard English as well. If test scores were in reality as arbitrary and unimportant as educators like to say, this long, unchecked slide ought to have been a matter of supreme unconcern. But few people believed in their heart of hearts that the slide did not matter. The College Board commissioned an inquiry by former Labor Secretary Willard Wirtz. Wirtz reported back in 1977, blaming excessive television viewing, easier textbooks, and a decade of distraction as the main villains. Most educators, however, preferred to accept the etiology offered by the Federal Office of Education. The Education Office administered the National Assessment of Educational Progress test, arguably the broadest test in the country. 71,000 randomly chosen students aged 9, 13, and 17 took it. Results had fallen precipitously between 1973 and 1977. The culprit? With considerable chutzpah, the Education Office put the blame on the school districts that still retained traditional curriculums. They were, the office charged, narrowing students' minds and hampering their learning. So in the face of the havoc wrought by the educational innovations of the 1960s, still more progressive teaching methods were introduced. New math gave way to newer math. Phonics was replaced by whole word reading. The tough old biddies who once taught school were replaced by eager young people charged with safeguarding the pupil's self-esteem. Test scores dwindled regardless. No surprise, really. In a close study of the origins of the decline of SAT scores between 1970 and 1980, Charles Murray points out that the average score slipped not because the average student got worse, but because the scores of the very best students were declining. Murray provocatively argued that schools had faced a harsh dilemma. A demanding curriculum frustrated the least capable students and sent dropout rates upward. An easy curriculum stunted the most capable students and depressed test scores. Post-Sputnik, most districts had opted for the first of these twin evils. Then alarm at the high dropout rate caused them to reverse course and opt for the second. The dumbing down of the curriculum was encouraged by changes within the teaching profession. The 1970s were the decade in which teaching was transformed from a low-paying, relatively prestigious profession to a relatively well-paid, unprestigious occupation. Despite the higher pay, however, the intellectual attainments of the people attracted to teaching tumbled even faster than the national average. The September 1979 issue of the magazine of Phi Delta Kappa, the Education School Honor Society, reported that the average verbal SAT score for college seniors who said they intended to teach had plunged by 26 points between 1973 and 1979, from 418 to 392. The drop for college-bound high school seniors as a whole was only 18 points. The math scores of would-be teachers plunged by 29 points against 14 points for all college-bound seniors. The key to the seeming mystery is unionization. In March 1971, the National Education Association affiliated itself with the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. 5 months later, at a bitter 3-week convention in Fort Collins, Colorado, the NEA voted to exclude school administrators from membership. As the NEA reinvented itself, it became ever more effective at squeezing pay raises for its members out of local governments. At the same time, it transformed the nature of the teaching profession. The inept and lazy gained a huge new increment of job security. Assignments would be distributed by seniority rather than skill. Teaching rosters, once filled with enthusiastic young en route to marriage and by the experienced elderly, retired military officers, housewives whose children had grown up, came to be dominated by lifers in their 40s and 50s who stuck to their jobs for the pay and the pension. And as American government unleashed a money inflation to mask the country's fiscal troubles, so American educators tried to hide the failings of the schools by inflating grades. In 1969, only 18% of college undergraduates reported a cumulative average of B+ or higher. In 1975, 36% reported a B+ or better, according to a 1977 study by Berkeley professor Martin Trout. Some professors may have been preserving their students' draft deferments, but the trend continued after the draft stopped. The students and parents of the 1970s had learned to expect more praise for less achievement. How could their teachers deny them? The young people of the 1970s had been plopped in front of a television set at an early age. Sesame Street first aired in 1969, assuaging the consciences of parents about letting their 3-year-olds watch television. They had grown up a generation characterized by poor verbal skills, inability to concentrate, and a reluctance to read. Even the boom generation's language tics, usages such as like and you know and sort of, bespoke its lack of precision. We are accustomed to thinking of the howdy-doody audiences as television's first victims, and so it was. But compared to what was to come later, the youth of the 50s seemed positively bookish. Cleveland State University's study conducted in the mid-1970s found that the number of hours devoted to television, records, and movies by 18 to 24-year-olds shot up from 13.9 per week in 1965 to 18.5 per week in 1976. Between 1977 and 1988, the proportion of high school seniors who reported reading a book, magazine, or newspaper almost every day diminished from 62% to 46%. A 1979 Gallup survey found that 1/4 of American young people had never read the Bible. By 1982, the National Opinion Research Center reported only 42% of Americans in their late 20s read a newspaper every day, and only about 1/4 of those in their early 20s. Back in a minute. Thank you. The 1970s saw the emergence of a whole new literary genre, the novelization. That is, the putting into book form of plots and characters already familiar from the movies or television. The Star Trek series was among the most successful. A publisher who produced novelizations suggested to one reporter that many people who buy novelizations of movies would find it hard to read a book if they hadn't already seen the film, which did the work of visualizing the characters and settings for them. William Paley, chairman of CBS, worriedly observed, quote, "There is a desire on the part of young people for messy shows. They don't want a good beginning, middle, and an end. They want the damn thing to sort of float around, and they either read something into it that the older generation can't, or they feel uncomfortable in not having things too carefully spelled out. The spirit of it is more important than the story part," unquote. Even the very best educated young people, the bright young men and women of Harvard and Vassar, now struggled with the written word. Pollsters had been asking Americans since the 1950s where they got most of their news. Among the population as a whole, television overtook newspapers in the early 1960s among the college-educated. The fateful moment was 1972. The early 1970s were also the moment at which the artistic young people with something to say decided that they wanted to make a film, as a movie now came to be called, rather than write a novel. Any critic of talent who devoted himself to the 50s to writing about ambitious current novels could expect to be read with far more attention and discussed with far more intensity than he would 10 years later, Norman Podhoretz observed in 1967. Novels kept being written, to be sure, but they had moved from the center of cultural life to the periphery. Robert Gottlieb, the chief editor at the storied publishing house of Alfred A. Knopf, told Publishers Weekly in 1972, "My impression is that many fewer young men and women coming out of college are desperate to get into publishing now than 15 years ago. Most of those hundreds of young people who used to come into publishing or try to come into publishing because they loved to read, most of them were really coming because it was, at that time, 1955 or 1960, a great glamour industry. Those same young men and women now all want to be in movies or in who knows what else, the record business." Even those young people who did still love to read were influenced in odd ways by the strange new theories swirling about university literature departments, theories that rejected the austere new criticism of the 1950s with its emphasis on pure aesthetics. A poem doesn't mean a poem is. In 1964, students aspiring to a BA in English at the University of Chicago were required to take 9 courses in English literature plus a year of English history. By 1989, Chicago had cut its requirements in half. The survey of English history had been dropped, and even Shakespeare was no longer compulsory. An ever more radical rejection of artistic and intellectual standards steamrolled through the academic world. Undistinguished writers of the right race, sex, or nationality, like Alice Walker or the soon-to-be notorious Rigoberto Menchú, displaced Milton and Dryden. The great hope of the 1950s that a democratic polity could sustain a high culture had been defeated. The very idea of high culture was discredited and discarded. In his introduction to the massive catalog of the Orsay collection, the lavish new museum that opened in Paris's grand old Gare d'Orsay in 1978, the influential art critic Robert Rosenblum boasted, quote, "The Musée d'Orsay is now the grandest international statement of what might be called a postmodernist view of 19th century art. In this view, the modernist belief in a century aesthetically polarized into the blacks and whites of left-wing, right-wing hero, villain, genius, daub has dissolved into infinite shades of gray. Instead of a battlefield, we have a huge family of artists whose connections with one another are far more subtle and binding, for they shared the experience of living together through some of or all of the same decades in Western history." Upholding standards according to Columbia professor Edward Said's Orientalism, the academic book that ranks almost certainly as the most influential and most frequently cited of the 1970s, is never a disinterested act of judgment. Instead, Said contended, the act of judging is always and necessarily an assertion of power, grounded in ideology and self-interest. The general liberal consensus that true knowledge is fundamentally non-political, and conversely that overtly political knowledge is not true knowledge, obscures the highly, if obscurely, organized political circumstances obtaining when knowledge is produced. There is no truth, there is only political muscle. And that was from the book, No Free Lunch, but from the book How We Got Here, the 70s. And the chapter is called Dumbing Down. Thank you. One of the things I was thinking about was something called the Fool's License, and it was all about the role of the fool in the king's court back in the medieval days. The fool had fool's license to tell the truth as long as he did so in an entertaining way. And it occurs to me that's one of the things that we need today. So in an era of hyper-partisanship, where we're becoming a culture in which you cannot tell the truth to each other we just can't tell the truth to each other. You've got to have somebody, let's say for instance, in the Joe Biden administration, to act as the fool, who will be able to have the audacity to actually talk the truth, so long as they, of course, do it in an entertaining way. But that way, at least, everybody will know what the truth is, despite all of this spin and counterspin and hyperspin, etc. So again, it seems to me that we could really use some fools today. Fools with the fool's license to tell the truth. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, reminding you that an excellent example of a conservative communication, anyways, is the John and Ken Show, even though they don't consider themselves conservative. And that's on KFI AM 640 from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Pacific time. So you can check that out or listen to their podcast on iHeart Radio. So until next time, remember to be polite, be smart, and be beautiful. And remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.